A jewelry store humiliated and kicked Samuel L. Jackson out. But what happened next shocked everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you saw this video. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Samuel L. Jackson's home, illuminating the polished hardwood floors and neatly arranged furniture. It was a peaceful day, the kind of quiet that lent itself to reflection. Samuel sat at his kitchen table, sipping his coffee and glancing at his calendar on the tablet in front of him. A small note caught his attention. Anniversary gift for LaTanya. For weeks, Samuel had been contemplating what to get his wife for their upcoming anniversary. After over 40 years of marriage, he wanted to give her something truly special, a gift that would speak to their enduring bond. Jewelry seemed the obvious choice, but not just any jewelry. It had to be unique, timeless, and worthy of the woman he adored. He had heard about a renowned jeweler in Beverly Hills, a place where the elite shopped for treasures that defined sophistication. The thought of visiting the store excited him. He imagined the sparkle in LaTanya's eyes when she opened the small box containing a ring that symbolized everything they had built together. Samuel wasn't one for unnecessary fanfare. He preferred to go about his day unrecognized, blending into the background. This trait, while admirable, often led to assumptions about him. As he stood in front of his closet, he reached for his usual attire, a pair of comfortable jeans, a simple black t-shirt, and his favorite leather jacket. To top it off, he grabbed a faded Yankees cap. No need to make a fuss, he muttered to himself as he headed out the door. The streets of Beverly Hills were bustling as he approached the jewelry store. The building stood like a beacon of wealth, its sleek, minimalist design exuding exclusivity. As Samuel walked in, the sound of a chime echoed through the space. The interior was stunning, with marble floors that gleamed under soft, recessed lighting. Elegant glass cases displayed rows of diamonds and gemstones, each piece more exquisite than the last. He paused for a moment, taking in the atmosphere. A faint whiff of luxury perfume lingered in the air, and the hum of quiet conversation added to the sense of refinement. Samuel's eyes scanned the room, noting the meticulously dressed clientele and equally polished staff. At first, no one acknowledged him. He stood near a display case, admiring a collection of rings with intricately set diamonds. Minutes passed, and he began to feel invisible. Finally, a young salesman, whose name tag read Ethan, approached him with a forced smile. Ethan's tailored suit and slicked-back hair seemed to suggest he was a man who prided himself on appearances. "Can I help you, sir?" Ethan asked, his tone polite but distant. Samuel nodded. "I'm looking for a special ring for my wife, something unique." Ethan's eyes briefly flicked over Samuel's attire. His smile tightened. "Of course, we have several collections, but they can be quite exclusive." The implication hung in the air. Samuel raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Instead, he gestured toward the rings in the case. Ethan hesitated, then reached beneath the glass to retrieve a tray of rings, placing it before Samuel with a precision that seemed almost reluctant. "These are from our mid-tier collection," Ethan explained. "Perhaps something here will catch your eye." Samuel examined the rings carefully, but none of them felt right. He looked up at Ethan. "What about the collection over there?" He pointed to a display case across the room, where the store's most prestigious pieces were kept under additional lock and key. Ethan blinked. "Those are part of our signature collection. They're quite pricey." Samuel's lips twitched into a faint smile. "That's fine. I'd like to see them." For a moment, Ethan seemed to waver. He glanced toward the manager, who stood near the back of the store observing the exchange. After a brief pause, Ethan nodded curtly. "I'll see what I can do." As Ethan walked away, Samuel noticed the other staff members whispering among themselves. A few glanced in his direction, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Samuel pretended not to notice, but a familiar weight settled in his chest. He had encountered this kind of subtle judgment countless times throughout his life. It wasn't overt hostility. It was something quieter, more insidious. Ethan returned with a small velvet tray containing 3 rings. Each one was a masterpiece, featuring intricate designs and dazzling stones that caught the light beautifully. Samuel leaned in, studying the craftsmanship. One ring in particular stood out, a platinum band with a radiant cut diamond surrounded by smaller sapphires. "This one," Samuel said, pointing to the ring. "I'd like to know more about it." Ethan hesitated again. "Are you sure, sir? This piece is quite expensive. Perhaps we should discuss pricing first." Samuel's jaw tightened. He met Ethan's gaze, his voice steady but firm. "I'm sure." Before Ethan could respond, another customer entered the store, drawing the attention of the staff. It was a woman draped in designer clothing, her jewelry sparkling with every step. Immediately, the energy in the room shifted. 2 salespeople rushed to greet her, their tones warm and enthusiastic. Samuel watched as she was ushered toward the very collection he had been eyeing. Ethan, sensing the change, placed the tray back onto the glass. "Excuse me for a moment, sir," he said before turning to assist the new customer. Samuel stood there, his patience wearing thin. He glanced around, noticing how the staff fawned over the woman while he was left waiting. His fingers tapped against the glass counter, a subtle outlet for his growing frustration. Minutes turned into what felt like an eternity. Finally, Ethan returned, but his demeanor had shifted entirely. His politeness was now laced with irritation, as though Samuel's presence was an inconvenience. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" Ethan asked, his tone clipped. Samuel took a deep breath, weighing his options. Part of him wanted to walk out, to leave the store and never return, but another part of him, the part that had faced countless challenges and refused to back down, decided otherwise. "Yes," Samuel said calmly. "I'd like to purchase that ring." Ethan blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Are you sure?" Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Do I not look sure?" Before Ethan could respond, another staff member approached, whispering something into his ear. Ethan's expression soured further. "I'm sorry, sir, but I believe we've shown you everything that's within your range." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Samuel stared at Ethan, his mind racing. He felt the weight of every slight, every assumption, every moment in his life when he had been judged unfairly. But instead of raising his voice or causing a scene, he simply nodded. "Thank you for your time," he said, his voice measured. Then he turned and walked out, the bell above the door chiming softly as he left. As he stepped onto the busy street, the cool air hit his face, offering a brief reprieve from the heat rising in his chest. He paused, taking a deep breath. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The afternoon sun bore down on the streets of Beverly Hills as Samuel L. Jackson walked away from the jewelry store. His hands were stuffed into the pockets of his jacket, his mind churning with the weight of what had just happened. He'd experienced subtle prejudices before, even outright racism in his younger days, but something about the condescending tone of the salesman, the dismissive glances from the staff, and the whispered judgments of onlookers felt sharper this time. Perhaps it was because he had come into the store with the purest of intentions, only to be met with skepticism and disdain. Samuel stopped at a nearby bench, sitting down and gazing at the people walking by. Tourists snapped photos of the luxury storefronts, their laughter and chatter blending with the hum of passing cars. To them, this part of the city was a paradise of wealth and glamour. For Samuel, it had just become a reminder of how easily someone could be reduced to their appearance. He replayed the scene in his mind, the looks, the whispers, and finally, the outright dismissal. They hadn't even tried to mask their judgment. The phrase, "within your range," echoed in his head, each syllable dripping with the assumption that he didn't belong there. What stung the most wasn't just the insult, but the fact that it had been so casual, so normalized. He pulled out his phone and opened his messages. A half-written text to Latanya sat unsent on the screen. He had started typing it before entering the store, excited to tell her about the ring he would choose. Now, the words felt hollow. Instead of finishing it, he locked the screen and slipped the phone back into his pocket. As he sat there, trying to collect his thoughts, a memory from his childhood surfaced. He was 10 years old, running errands with his grandfather in Chattanooga, Tennessee. They had gone into a general store, and the clerk had refused to serve them until all the white customers had been helped first. Samuel's grandfather had simply nodded, saying, "We'll wait." But Samuel had seen the tension in the old man's shoulders, the quiet anger in his eyes. Now, decades later, Samuel felt that same quiet anger boiling within him. He had come into the jewelry store not as an actor or a celebrity, but as a husband, a man trying to do something meaningful for the woman he loved. And yet, none of that had mattered. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car horn. A black SUV had pulled up to the curb in front of him. The driver, a member of his security team, rolled down the window. "Mr. Jackson, everything okay?" the man asked, concern evident in his tone. Samuel gave a small nod. "Yeah, just needed a moment." The driver hesitated, but said nothing more, rolling the window back up. Samuel stood, dusting off his jeans, and headed toward the car. As he reached for the door handle, he glanced back at the jewelry store. Through the glass, he could see the same salesman chatting animatedly with a well-dressed couple. They were laughing, their interaction warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the cold reception he had received. He didn't enter the car. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the store, his strides purposeful. He wasn't done. Not yet. The bell above the door chimed again as he stepped inside. The sound cut through the hushed conversations, drawing the attention of the staff. Ethan, the salesman who had dismissed him earlier, froze mid-sentence. His smile faltered when he saw Samuel. "Sir," Ethan began, his tone now laced with irritation. "Is there something else I can help you with?" "Yes," Samuel replied evenly. "I'd like to see that ring again." The room grew noticeably quieter. Other customers began to take note of the exchange, their curiosity piqued. Ethan hesitated, glancing toward the manager, who was now standing near the back of the store with a frown. "Sir, I'm afraid," Ethan started, but Samuel cut him off. "Let me make this clear," Samuel said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to waste your time. I've already told you what I want, and I have no intention of leaving until I get it." Ethan's cheeks flushed slightly, but before he could respond, the manager approached. A middle-aged man with slicked-back hair and a tailored suit, he exuded the air of someone accustomed to control. "Is there a problem here?" the manager asked. His tone clipped. Samuel turned to face him. "The only problem is your employee's inability to provide the service I've asked for. I came here to purchase a ring, but instead, I've been treated as though I don't belong." The manager's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression unreadable. "I apologize if you feel that way, sir. However, our staff is trained to assess—" "To assess what?" Samuel interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Whether someone like me looks like they can afford to shop here?" A murmur rippled through the store. Customers exchanged glances, some whispering amongst themselves. The tension in the air was palpable. The manager's jaw tightened. "Sir, if you're not satisfied with our service, I suggest you take your business elsewhere." It was a dismissal, clear and unmistakable. For a moment, Samuel considered pushing further, but then he realized something. Nothing he said in that moment would change their minds. Their prejudice was too deeply rooted, too ingrained in their perception of who belonged and who didn't. He gave the manager a long, measured look before stepping back. "Don't worry," he said quietly. "I will." With that, he turned and walked out of the store, his steps steady but heavy with frustration. The bell above the door chimed once more, marking his exit. This time, he didn't look back. Outside, the SUV was waiting. Samuel climbed in and closed the door behind him. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "Back home, sir?" the driver asked. Samuel stared out the window, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "Take me home." As the car pulled away from the curb, Samuel's mind raced. The anger he felt wasn't just for himself. It was for every person who had ever been made to feel small, to feel invisible, because of someone else's assumptions. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The car ride home was a quiet one. The usual buzz of Los Angeles traffic outside the window seemed muffled, as if the world had been turned down to low volume. Samuel sat in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the passing buildings and people, his thoughts drifting somewhere far beyond. The humiliation from the jewelry store replayed in his mind, each detail sharper than the last, his frustration simmering beneath a layer of forced calm. His security driver glanced in the rearview mirror occasionally, concern evident on his face. He knew Samuel well enough to recognize when something had unsettled him, but the driver remained silent, respecting his boss's privacy. Samuel didn't need words at the moment. He needed time to process, to make sense of what had happened. As they turned into the driveway of his home, Samuel sighed deeply. The grand facade of his house came into view, the manicured garden and the welcoming front door that seemed to promise peace. It was his sanctuary, the place where he could shed all the layers the world demanded he wear and just be himself. But even as he stepped out of the SUV and approached the door, the frustration followed him, clinging to him like a stubborn shadow. LaTanya was waiting inside, her warm smile immediately lighting up when she saw him. She could always read his moods without him having to say a word. She noticed the tension in his face, the slight droop of his shoulders, and her smile softened into one of concern. "Hey, baby," she said gently, reaching up to touch his cheek. "Rough day?" Samuel tried to smile back, but it came out as more of a grimace. "Yeah," he replied, his voice low. "Something like that." He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a hug. For a moment he closed his eyes, breathing in her familiar scent, warm, comforting, like home. It eased some of the tightness in his chest, but the weight of the day still lingered. They moved to the living room, where LaTanya settled next to him on the couch. She took his hand in hers, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked. Samuel hesitated. He wasn't sure how to put everything he felt into words, but he knew he needed to let it out. He needed her to understand, even though he also knew it would make her sad. "I went to that jewelry store today," he began slowly. "The one in Beverly Hills." LaTanya nodded, her eyes filled with curiosity and concern. "Did you find anything?" Samuel let out a bitter chuckle. "I didn't get the chance. They took one look at me, and it was like they'd already decided I didn't belong there." He recounted what had happened, each detail still vivid in his mind. The dismissive glances, the condescending tone of the salesman, the outright rejection by the manager. LaTanya listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with every word. When he finished, she shook her head, her brow furrowed. "I can't believe they treated you like that. After everything, after all these years, you'd think people would know better." Samuel sighed, rubbing his temples. "You'd think, but here we are." LaTanya looked at him, her eyes filled with empathy and sadness. "I'm so sorry, Sam. You didn't deserve that. No one does." He nodded, but her words only seemed to deepen the ache in his chest. It wasn't just about what he had experienced. It was about the fact that this kind of prejudice still existed, that people were still judged based on appearances, on stereotypes that should have been long dead by now. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. Finally, LaTanya spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. "You know, you don't have to prove anything to them. You're Samuel L. Jackson. They don't know who they're dealing with." Samuel smiled at that, a small but genuine smile this time. "It's not about proving anything to them," he said. "It's about making sure that people like them know they can't get away with this. Not anymore." LaTanya nodded, understanding. She had always admired his resilience, his refusal to back down in the face of injustice. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Samuel admitted, "but I'm not letting this go. Not this time." LaTanya squeezed his hand again. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." That night, after LaTanya had gone to bed, Samuel sat in his study, staring at the screen of his laptop. He opened a blank document and began to type. His fingers moved slowly at first, as he tried to find the right words to express what he felt. But soon the words began to flow, each one bringing him a sense of clarity. He wrote about the jewelry store, about the subtle but undeniable prejudice he had faced. He wrote about how this wasn't just his experience. It was the experience of countless people who were judged not by their character or their intentions, but by their appearance. He wrote about how exhausting it was, how deeply it hurt, and how it needed to stop. When he finished, he sat back, reading over what he had written. The words felt raw, honest. He knew he couldn't keep them to himself. This was a story that needed to be told. He logged onto his social media account, attaching the document he had just written. For a moment, he hesitated. He knew the kind of attention this would draw, both good and bad. But as he thought back to the looks on the faces of the people in the store, the dismissive tone of the salesman, he knew this was the right thing to do. With a deep breath, he hit post. The response was immediate. Within minutes, comments began to pour in, some expressing outrage at what had happened, others sharing their own similar experiences. The post began to gain traction, shared by friends, colleagues, and strangers alike. Samuel watched as the numbers climbed, the outpouring of support both heartening and disheartening at the same time. It was a reminder of just how many people had faced the same kind of prejudice and the same subtle discrimination that left them feeling less than. As the hours passed, the post went viral. News outlets picked it up, headlines popping up across social media. Samuel received messages from journalists, activists, and even other celebrities, all offering their support. The story had struck a chord, resonating with people far beyond his usual audience. But even as the support poured in, Samuel knew this was just the beginning. He hadn't written the post to gain sympathy or to start a trending topic. He had written it to shine a light on a problem that too many people tried to ignore, to make sure that what had happened to him wouldn't be brushed under the rug. The next morning, as he sat at the kitchen table with LaTanya, his phone buzzed with notifications. One of the messages was from an old friend, a civil rights lawyer he had worked with on a few projects over the years. The message was brief but to the point. "We need to talk. Let's do something about this." Samuel looked at the message for a long moment before showing it to LaTanya. She read it, then looked up at him, a smile tugging at her lips. "Looks like you've got some work to do," she said. Samuel nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "Yeah, I think it's time." That day, he made a series of phone calls, reaching out to people who could help him turn his words into action. He spoke with his lawyer friend, discussing the possibility of taking legal action against the store. Not just for himself, but for anyone who had faced similar discrimination. He reached out to a few journalists who had covered his post, agreeing to do interviews and share his story more widely. As the day went on, the idea of returning to the store began to take shape in his mind. But this time, he wouldn't go alone. He would bring the eyes of the world with him, ensuring that the store, and anyone else who thought they could treat people differently based on appearance, would be held accountable. He spent the next few days preparing, reaching out to media contacts, coordinating with activists, and making sure that when he returned to that store, it wouldn't be just another customer walking through the door. It would be a statement, a stand against the kind of discrimination that too many people had grown accustomed to enduring. LaTanya watched as he worked, her pride in him growing with each passing day. She knew how much this meant to him, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. This wasn't just about a ring or a store. It was about standing up to a system that needed to change. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Samuel looked over at LaTanya, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, I didn't just go to that store for any ring," he said. "I wanted something that would really mean something, something that would remind you of us." LaTanya smiled, her eyes glistening. "I don't need a ring to be reminded of that, Sam," she said softly. "But I love that you want to fight for it." Samuel leaned over, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I'm fighting for more than just the ring," he said. "I'm fighting for all of us." LaTanya nodded, her heart swelling with love and pride. She knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that could make a real difference. And she knew that, no matter what, she would be right there by his side every step of the way. Samuel sat in his study, surrounded by half-filled notebooks, his laptop, and a coffee cup that had gone cold hours ago. The words he had posted online had resonated far and wide. People were talking, sharing, and discussing. But deep down, Samuel knew that words, while powerful, needed action to back them up. He couldn't just let this moment pass. He needed to make sure the people at that jewelry store, and those like them, learned a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts. He paused at a name that stood out. Richard Blake, an old friend and a civil rights attorney who had made it his mission to tackle discrimination head-on. Richard had sent a message right after Samuel's post went viral. "We need to talk. Let's do something about this." Samuel tapped the number, the phone ringing only once before Richard answered. "Sam?" Richard's voice was calm, but carried an edge of determination. "I've been waiting for your call. I think it's time we make some noise, Richard," Samuel replied, his voice equally steady. He could hear his own heartbeat, the weight of what they were about to undertake sinking in. "We need to make an example out of what happened." They spoke for nearly an hour, discussing strategies, the legal implications, and the public pressure they could leverage. Samuel listened as Richard outlined possible approaches: a lawsuit for discrimination, public advocacy, pushing for policy changes to ensure that places like the jewelry store received mandatory training against racial profiling. By the end of the conversation, Samuel felt a renewed sense of purpose. "I'll take the legal route," Richard said, "but I think what you're planning to do could have an even bigger impact in the public eye." Samuel leaned back in his chair, a smile tugging at his lips. "Oh, trust me, I plan on going back there, and this time it's going to be a little different." After the call, Samuel turned to his laptop, opening a fresh email draft. He began typing out messages to some trusted contacts in the media industry, journalists he'd known for years, people who understood the deeper importance of stories like his. He was determined to not let this be a mere tabloid sensation. This was about changing minds, opening eyes, and demanding respect. The response was immediate. Some replied to his emails within minutes, their curiosity piqued by what he was planning. Samuel offered no details, only telling them that they might want to be present at the jewelry store in Beverly Hills on a specific date. He wanted them to see for themselves what he intended to do, to bear witness to the change he wanted to spark. In the following days, Samuel spent hours coordinating with the media, preparing statements, and connecting with activists who had made it their mission to address racial bias in everyday scenarios. He reached out to a few prominent figures in the community, people who had fought battles like his, who understood the sting of being judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. One of those people was Angela Carter, an activist whose work Samuel admired. Angela had dedicated her life to challenging systemic racism and was known for her powerful speeches and unwavering determination. Samuel reached out to her, and they met for coffee at a small cafe in Los Angeles, tucked away from the glitz and glamour of Beverly Hills. Angela listened as Samuel outlined what had happened, her expression shifting from sympathy to outrage as he described the jewelry store incident. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "You want to go back there, but this time, bring the media with you?" she asked, her voice carrying a mix of curiosity and admiration. Samuel nodded. "I want to confront them. I want them to see that they can't treat people this way, not without consequences. And I need people to see it, to see what discrimination looks like in real time." Angela smiled, a fierce glint in her eyes. "You're talking about accountability, and I'm all in. I've been to too many rallies, seen too many people suffer because of the same old prejudices. If we can shine a light on this, make it impossible for them to ignore, then count me in. Together, they planned out the next steps. Angela would bring her network, the activists who had helped organize demonstrations and public actions in the past. Samuel would handle the media, ensuring the coverage they needed to make their voices heard. Back home, Samuel shared his plans with LaTanya. She listened attentively, her eyes fixed on his as he described the confrontation he was preparing for. Though he knew she was proud of him, Samuel could sense her concern. "Are you sure about this?" LaTanya asked, her brow furrowed. "You know how these things can go, Sam. People will try to twist it, to make it seem like you're just causing trouble." Samuel nodded. "I know, but I can't let this slide, LaTanya. If I walk away now, then I'm just accepting it. And it's not just about me. It's about anyone who's ever walked into a store and felt like they didn't belong just because of how they looked." LaTanya reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. She squeezed it gently, her expression softening. "I understand. Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," Samuel said, leaning in to kiss her forehead. "I'll be careful, but I have to do this." As the day of the planned return approached, Samuel could feel the tension building. He went over every detail with Richard and Angela, ensuring that everyone knew their roles, that every aspect was covered. It was more than just a confrontation. It was a statement, one that he wanted to resonate far beyond the walls of that jewelry store. The night before, Samuel sat in his study once again, staring at his reflection in the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and the faint sound of cars on the freeway provided a soft background hum. He thought about his grandfather, about the lessons the old man had taught him. He remembered the times they had faced prejudice together, the way his grandfather had always told him to hold his head high, to never let anyone make him feel lesser. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the silence. It was a message from Angela. "We're ready. See you tomorrow." Samuel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. He typed a quick response. "See you then," before putting his phone away. He knew tomorrow would be challenging, but it would also be necessary. It was time to stand up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated as though they didn't belong. The morning of the confrontation was bright and clear. Samuel dressed carefully, choosing a tailored suit, a symbol of the success he had worked for, a reminder that he had earned his place. He adjusted his tie in the mirror, taking a deep breath before heading downstairs. LaTanya was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. She smiled up at him, her eyes shining with a mix of pride and love. "You look good," she said, her voice soft. Samuel smiled back, leaning down to kiss her. "Thanks, babe. I'm going to need all the luck I can get." "You've got this," LaTanya said, her voice steady. "Just remember, you're not alone." He nodded, her words giving him strength. As he stepped out of the house, he felt a sense of resolve settle over him. This was it. This was the moment he would take a stand, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever faced the same kind of silent, insidious discrimination. The SUV pulled up in front of the jewelry store, and Samuel could see the crowd already gathered. Journalists stood with their cameras at the ready. Activists held signs, and curious onlookers watched from a distance. The energy was electric, anticipation crackling in the air. Angela was there, standing near the entrance with a group of activists. She waved when she saw Samuel, her expression one of determination. Samuel stepped out of the SUV, straightening his jacket as he approached the entrance. The journalists moved closer, their cameras clicking, capturing every moment. Samuel took a deep breath, feeling the eyes of the crowd on him. He glanced at Angela, who gave him an encouraging nod. It was time. He walked up to the entrance, the bell above the door chiming as he stepped inside. The atmosphere in the store was different this time, tense, uncertain. The staff turned to look at him, their eyes widening when they realized who had just walked in. The same salesman from before, Ethan, was standing near the display case. His face paled as he saw Samuel, his eyes darting nervously to the crowd outside. The manager, who had dismissed Samuel so casually before, appeared from the back of the store, his expression a mix of surprise and unease. "Mr. Jackson," the manager began, his voice shaky. I wasn't expecting you." Samuel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I figured you wouldn't be," he said, his voice carrying through the store. He gestured toward the door where the crowd could be seen through the glass. "I thought I'd bring a few friends along this time," he said, "so we can have a real conversation about how you treat people in this place." The manager swallowed, clearly caught off guard. "I assure you, Mr. Jackson, there must have been some misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding," Samuel interrupted, his voice steady but firm. "I was treated differently because of how I looked, and I'm not here to let that slide." The store was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Samuel could feel the weight of every eye on him, the anticipation of what would happen next. He took a deep breath, looking the manager in the eye. "We're going to make sure this doesn't happen again," he said, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "Not here, not anywhere." The cameras outside continued to click, the journalists capturing every word, every reaction. Samuel knew this was just the beginning, that the real work lay ahead. But for now, he had taken the first step. He had stood up, and he wasn't backing down. The morning sun glinted off the polished glass of the jewelry store, casting reflections on the pavement. The once tranquil streets of Beverly Hills were now alive with an unusual energy. News vans lined the curb, their satellite dishes angled toward the sky. Cameras and microphones at the ready. Journalists and reporters, each one hoping for a scoop, mingled among the crowd of onlookers gathered outside the store. Activists held signs reading, "End discrimination now," and "Everyone deserves respect," their voices rising in chants as they stood in solidarity. Angela Carter was among the crowd, her presence lending an air of determination to the gathering. She moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the growing audience, ensuring that everyone knew why they were here. This wasn't just about Samuel L. Jackson. This was about every person who had ever been marginalized, dismissed, or judged based on their appearance. Samuel sat in the back of the black SUV that had brought him here, watching the scene unfold through the tinted windows. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was bigger than anything he'd done before, not in terms of fame or career, but in terms of personal significance. He had faced countless challenges in his life, but today felt different. Today, he wasn't standing on a movie set. He was standing in front of a system that had hurt him and so many others, and he wasn't backing down. "Mr. Jackson," the driver said, turning slightly in his seat, "it's time." Samuel nodded, his eyes narrowing as he prepared himself. He glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror, straightened his tie, and adjusted his tailored suit, a symbol of the success and dignity he'd worked so hard to earn. He pushed open the car door and stepped out, greeted immediately by the hum of cameras clicking and reporters shouting questions. "Mr. Jackson, are you here to address the incident from last week? Samuel, can you tell us what you hope to achieve today?" He didn't answer, his face set in a determined expression as he moved through the crowd. Angela caught his eye and walked toward him, her smile one of reassurance. "You ready?" she asked, her voice steady despite the commotion around them. Samuel nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "Ready as I'll ever be." They turned toward the store, Angela stepping aside so Samuel could lead the way. He approached the entrance, the crowd parting to make room. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. The atmosphere in the store was charged. Every eye turned to him, from the customers browsing the jewelry to the staff who had come to recognize him all too well. The manager, a middle-aged man with a practiced smile, stood near the back of the store. His face visibly paled as Samuel walked in, his eyes darting to the cameras outside. The other salespeople shifted uncomfortably, some glancing toward Ethan, the young salesman who had first dismissed Samuel. Ethan stood frozen, his expression one of apprehension. Samuel moved forward with calm confidence, his eyes locking onto the manager's. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying through the space. It was a simple greeting, but there was an unmistakable power behind it, a statement in itself. The manager cleared his throat, his voice faltering slightly. "Mr. Jackson, I wasn't expecting—" Samuel raised a hand, cutting him off. "I'm sure you weren't, but I'm here now, and we need to talk." He gestured to the glass cases, filled with the expensive jewelry that had once seemed so out of reach. "Last time I was here, I was treated as though I didn't belong. I was judged based on how I looked, not on who I am or what I wanted. And I'm not just talking about myself. I'm talking about every person who walks through those doors, hoping for a fair experience." The store was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The manager's face flushed, his eyes flickering nervously toward the door where the cameras were still visible. He opened his mouth to speak, but Samuel didn't give him a chance. "You see, the problem isn't just about one bad interaction," Samuel continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about a mindset that says some people are more deserving of respect than others just because of how they look or how they dress. That's the problem, and it's not just in this store. It's everywhere." He turned his gaze to Ethan, the young salesman who had dismissed him before. Ethan looked visibly shaken, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Samuel's expression softened slightly as he addressed him. "Do you know why I came back?" Samuel asked, his voice quieter now, almost gentle. "I didn't come back to make you feel small or to get revenge. I came back because I want you to understand the power you hold when you interact with people. Every customer that walks through that door, every single one, deserves to be treated with dignity." Ethan swallowed, his eyes wide. He nodded slightly, but his voice seemed to have left him. Samuel turned back to the manager, his expression hardening once more. "I want to make something very clear," he said. "This kind of behavior, the prejudice, the condescension, it needs to end. Not just for me, but for everyone." The manager nodded, his voice shaky. I understand, Mr. Jackson. We're willing to make changes, to do whatever it takes to address this." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Good, because people are watching now, and they won't let you forget it." He stepped back, turning toward the door. The bell chimed again as he pushed it open, stepping out into the sunlight. The crowd erupted into cheers, the reporters pressing forward to catch his words. Samuel raised his hand, motioning for silence. The crowd quieted, their eyes fixed on him. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "This is about respect. It's about making sure that no one, no matter who they are, no matter how they look, is ever made to feel less than. We're better than this, and it's time we start acting like it." The crowd responded with applause. Angela, stepping up beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, she smiled at him, her eyes filled with pride. "You did good, Sam," she said, her voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. Samuel nodded, his eyes scanning the faces around him. He could see the determination in their expressions, the hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better. He knew this was only the first step. There was still so much work to be done. But for now, he had done what he came here to do. He looked back at Angela, his expression one of gratitude. "This is just the start, Angela. We've got a lot more to do." Angela smiled, her eyes shining with conviction. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The crowd began to disperse slowly, the journalists wrapping up their coverage, the activists exchanging words of encouragement. Samuel stood for a moment, watching as people began to leave, their spirits lifted. He could feel the change in the air, small but undeniable. It was a step forward, and that was what mattered. As he turned to leave, Angela walked beside him, her arm looped through his. They made their way to his car, the driver waiting patiently. Samuel paused before getting in, turning to Angela. "Thank you for being here today," he said, his voice sincere. Angela smiled, shaking her head. "Thank you, Samuel, for standing up, for making sure people know they have a voice." Samuel nodded, stepping into the car. As the door closed behind him, he took a deep breath, the tension of the day beginning to ebb away. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, a small smile on his lips. "Where to now, sir?" the driver asked. Samuel looked out the window, the jewelry store fading into the distance. He thought of Latanya, waiting at home, the promise he'd made to her to be careful, to do what was right. "Home," Samuel said, his voice calm. "Take me home." The car pulled away from the curb, the crowd outside the jewelry store growing smaller in the rearview mirror. Samuel leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment. He had taken a stand, made his voice heard. And while the road ahead was still long, he knew that this was the beginning of something greater. Today, he hadn't just fought for himself. He had fought for everyone who had ever been judged, overlooked, or dismissed. And that, to Samuel, made all the difference. The sky was a brilliant shade of blue as Samuel L. Jackson's car pulled into his driveway. The tension of the past few hours still clung to his body, but there was a sense of fulfillment as well, an understanding that he had stood his ground for something far greater than himself. Latanya was waiting at the front door, and as soon as he stepped out of the car, she wrapped her arms around him. The warmth of her embrace dissolved some of the heaviness he had been carrying. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice soft yet tinged with concern. Samuel pulled back slightly to look into her eyes, his lips curving into a small smile. "It went well," he said simply, knowing that there was no need for elaborate explanations. Latanya could see it in his eyes, the relief, the fire that was still burning, and she knew he had done exactly what he set out to do. She led him into the house, her hand resting on his arm as if to anchor him. They settled on the living room couch, and she reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his. "You really made a difference today, didn't you?" Samuel nodded. "I hope so. At least, it felt like it was a step in the right direction." LaTanya leaned her head against his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Sam. You spoke up when others wouldn't, and that matters." He smiled, kissing the top of her head. "Thank you, babe, for always being there, for always believing in me." The next few days passed in a blur of media attention, interviews, and meetings. Samuel found himself speaking with journalists from major outlets, his words echoing across TV screens and headlines. It wasn't about him. It was about the message, the need for change. People listened, some applauded, others criticized, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that the conversation had begun, and it wasn't going to be silenced any time soon. Richard Blake, his lawyer friend, called one afternoon as Samuel was sitting on the back patio, the sunlight warming his face. "You made quite an impression, Sam," Richard said, his voice filled with admiration. "The store has already reached out to me. They want to settle, offer a public apology, make donations, do whatever it takes to save face." Samuel let out a sigh, a mixture of relief and satisfaction. "They should apologize, but it can't stop there. We need to make sure that this actually leads to real change, not just some PR stunt to make them look good." Richard agreed, and they spent the next hour discussing the terms they would demand: mandatory training for all employees on racial bias, public donations to organizations that supported equality, and a personal apology from the store's management to Samuel and the community they had disrespected. The news soon broke that the jewelry store was making sweeping changes. They released a statement apologizing for their actions, promising to do better, and detailing the steps they would take to prevent future incidents. The apology was featured on several news networks, accompanied by a video from the store's manager, who spoke directly to the camera, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his discomfort. Samuel watched the apology with LaTanya beside him, her hand resting gently on his knee. "Do you think they really mean it?" she asked, her voice filled with a hint of skepticism. Samuel took a deep breath. "I think they mean it because they have to. Whether it's genuine or not, I guess time will tell. But the fact that they're even doing this, that they're admitting they were wrong, that's something. It's a start." LaTanya nodded, her gaze fixed on the TV screen. A start is better than nothing. And maybe, just maybe, it'll make someone think twice next time. The next week, Samuel received an invitation to return to the jewelry store, this time under very different circumstances. They wanted him to visit and see the changes they had made, to meet the staff, to witness the training they were undergoing. At first, Samuel hesitated. The thought of walking back into that place brought a wave of emotions: anger, hurt, frustration, but LaTanya encouraged him. "You faced them once, Sam," she said, "and you did it for all the right reasons. Going back there now, seeing what's changed, that's part of the journey, too." Samuel knew she was right, and so, dressed in the same suit he had worn the day of the confrontation, he found himself once again standing at the entrance of the jewelry store, the bell above the door chiming softly as he stepped inside. This time, the atmosphere was different. It wasn't just the absence of judgmental stares or whispered comments. It was something deeper, a genuine effort to make amends. The manager greeted him personally, his demeanor humble, almost nervous. He led Samuel around the store, introducing him to the staff, each one of them offering apologies and promising to do better. Ethan, the young salesman who had dismissed Samuel that first day, approached him, his face flushed but determined. "Mr. Jackson, I want to apologize," he said, his voice sincere. "I didn't realize how wrong I was, how much harm I was doing. I'm truly sorry." Samuel looked at Ethan for a long moment, his gaze steady. He could see the fear in the young man's eyes, the vulnerability. And in that moment, Samuel felt something shift inside him. The anger that had burned so hot that day began to cool, replaced by something else, something that felt like hope. "Thank you, Ethan," Samuel said, his voice calm. "I appreciate your apology. But remember, it's not just about apologizing. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again, to me or to anyone else." Ethan nodded, his eyes glistening. "I understand, sir, and I promise I'll do better." Samuel patted Ethan on the shoulder, offering a small smile. That's all anyone can ask. As he left the store that day, Samuel felt a sense of closure that he hadn't realized he needed. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it was a step in the right direction, and sometimes that was enough. The story continued to spread, the jewelry store's changes setting an example for other businesses. Samuel received messages from people all over the country, some sharing their own stories of discrimination, others thanking him for standing up. He read each one, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sadness. There was still so much work to do, so many people who needed to be heard, to be seen. One evening, as he sat on the back porch with LaTanya, the two of them watching the sun dip below the horizon, she turned to him, her eyes filled with love. "You know, Sam, I think you've started something important," she said, "something that's going to make a difference for a lot of people." Samuel smiled, his hand reaching for hers. "I hope so. I really do." LaTanya leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice soft. "You did it for us, for our kids, for everyone who deserves better." Samuel nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, the promise of a new day just beyond the edge of the earth. And in that moment, he knew that no matter what came next, he would keep fighting. For LaTanya, for their family, and for every person who had ever been made to feel less than. Because everyone deserved respect, everyone deserved dignity, and as long as he had a voice, Samuel L. Jackson would make sure that message was heard, loud and clear. The following weeks were filled with new initiatives spurred by the changes at the jewelry store. Samuel, with the help of Angela and Richard, began working on a campaign to bring awareness to discrimination in the retail and service industries. They partnered with community organizations, launched educational programs, and created safe spaces for people to share their experiences. The response was overwhelming. People were eager to speak out, to demand the change they had been waiting for. Samuel also began working with young actors and artists, using his platform to mentor them not just in their craft, but in understanding the power they held, the power to inspire change, to use their voices for something bigger than themselves. He spoke at schools, community centers, and gatherings, sharing his story and encouraging others to do the same. One day, he received a letter from a young man named Marcus, who wrote about his own experience with discrimination. Marcus described how he had been denied service at a high-end clothing store because of how he looked, and how seeing Samuel's story had given him the courage to speak out. He ended the letter with a simple sentence: "Thank you for giving me the strength to fight back." Samuel read the letter several times, the words resonating deep within him. He thought about all the people who had faced what Marcus had faced, what he had faced, people who had been made to feel like they didn't belong, and he realized that this, more than anything, was why he had done what he did. It wasn't just about a ring or a jewelry store. It was about giving people the strength to fight for their dignity, their right to be treated with respect. LaTanya found him sitting at his desk, the letter in his hand, tears glistening in his eyes. She knelt beside him, her arms wrapping around him as she rested her head against his chest. "What is it, Sam?" she asked, her voice gentle. Samuel handed her the letter, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke. "It's working, LaTanya. People are listening. They're finding their voices." She read the letter, her own eyes welling with tears as she looked up at him. "You've always had the power to change the world, Sam, and now you're doing it." Samuel nodded, his heart swelling with love and pride. He knew there was still so much work to do, so many people who needed to be heard, but he also knew that he had taken the first step, that he had helped open the door for others to follow, and that, to Samuel, was the greatest victory of all. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss new episodes. Share this video with your friends to let more people know about it. Also, don't forget to check out the channel to see the other stories we have in store for you.